Before California was American, before it was Mexican, before it appeared on maps as a destination of opportunity, it existed in a completely different state. In 1769, this land was not a state, not a province, and not a clearly defined territory. It was a distant edge of an empire that barely reached it, a place more imagined than controlled. There were no skylines along the coast, no cities with familiar names, no roads, no promise of sudden wealth. What existed instead was distance, uncertainty, and silence. A vast coastline stretching farther than most sailors had ever traveled, forests and valleys untouched by European measurement, deserts and mountains that resisted easy passage. And across this land lived communities who had shaped it for thousands of years, long before any foreign flag was raised. California in 1769 was not empty. But to the great empires watching from across the ocean, it was still largely invisible. That invisibility, however, was about to end. This is the story of California at the moment when the world finally began to notice it. In the middle of the 18th century, California existed in a strange and fragile condition. On paper, it belonged to Spain. In reality, Spain's presence there was minimal, distant, and uncertain. From Madrid, California appeared as a thin line on the far edge of imperial maps, a territory claimed by words rather than by people. Spanish explorers had known of the California coast for generations. Ships had sailed past it, chroniclers had described it, and officials had debated its importance. Yet almost no one stayed. The land was too far from established centers of power, supply routes were long and unreliable, and maintaining permanent settlements seemed unnecessary as long as no rival empire attempted to claim it. For decades, this strategy worked. California remained quiet, peripheral, and largely ignored. But by the 1760s, the balance that had protected this neglect began to shift. Across the Pacific world, other powers were expanding. Russian fur traders pushed steadily south along the northern coast. British ships explored farther into the Pacific, mapping shorelines and testing influence. France increased its naval ambitions. Spain, once the dominant force on the oceans, now found itself responding to movements rather than directing them. Suddenly, California mattered, not because of what it produced, but because of where it was. If another empire established a port along this coast, Spain's control of the Pacific trade routes would be threatened. The danger was not immediate, but it was enough to provoke action. And so, in 1769, Spain made a decisive choice. It would no longer merely claim California. It would finally occupy it. The expedition that set out toward California in 1769 was not a confident march of conquest. It was cautious, fragmented, and filled with uncertainty. Soldiers, missionaries, sailors, and laborers traveled north from New Spain, some moving slowly overland through harsh terrain, others navigating unpredictable coastal waters. They carried tools, seeds, livestock, religious objects, and instructions from authorities who would never see the land themselves. Supplies were limited. Disease spread easily. Navigation was unreliable. Many of those who began the journey would not survive to its end, yet they continued, driven not by promises of wealth, but by fear of loss. California had become important not for what it offered, but for what Spain risked losing if it did nothing. When the expedition finally reached the coast, they did not arrive at an empty wilderness. They encountered a living landscape shaped by generations of indigenous communities. Trails connected villages. Seasonal movement followed the rhythms of nature. Fire was used deliberately to manage forests and grasslands. The land was not untouched. It was understood. But to Spanish eyes, the absence of stone cities or centralized political structures suggested opportunity. What was familiar to those who lived there was invisible to those who had just arrived. The first Spanish camps were temporary and uncertain. There were no grand ceremonies, no immediate cities rising from the ground. Just exhausted men stepping onto unfamiliar soil, counting supplies, building provisional shelters, and trying to understand whether survival itself was possible. California did not welcome them easily. What made 1769 different from every year before, it was not scale or speed. It was intention. For the first time, Spain was not merely observing California or passing by its shores. It was committing to permanence. Missions would be built. Military outposts would follow. Settlements, however fragile, would take root. At the time, few understood the importance of what was happening. There were no headlines announcing a new era, no sense that history was turning. Yet everything California would later become traces back to this moment, not to gold or cities, but to a decision made far away, to finally arrive. And that arrival would reshape the land, its people, and its future in ways no one yet understood. Spain's presence in California did not begin with prosperity or stability. It began with missions, religious outposts designed to anchor empire, impose order, and transform daily life. In the next chapter, we step inside those first missions to see how life unfolded at the edge of a distant empire, where belief, survival, and control became inseparable. When Spain committed to California in 1769, it did not do so through cities or large settlements. It did so through missions. These were not designed simply as places of worship. They were instruments of occupation, control, and transformation, meant to anchor Spanish presence in a land that was still largely unknown to them. The first missions were built slowly and cautiously. There was no abundance of materials, no established workforce, no infrastructure waiting to be used. Everything had to be created from the ground up, often with limited tools and under constant uncertainty. Adobe bricks were shaped by hand and left to dry under the sun. Roofs were built with timber gathered nearby. Walls were thick, meant to protect against both climate and time. Life inside a mission followed a rigid rhythm. Days began early, often before sunrise, marked by bells that regulated movement, labor, and prayer. Time itself was structured differently here. Every activity had a place, every hour a purpose. Survival depended on discipline. Food production became a central concern. Crops unfamiliar to the region were planted and tested. Wheat, corn, beans, and vegetables were introduced alongside livestock brought from the south. Some thrived, others failed. Hunger was a constant threat, especially in the early years, when harvests were unpredictable and supply ships arrived irregularly. Within these spaces, religion and labor were inseparable. Prayer framed the day, but work sustained it. Fields were cultivated, animals tended, tools repaired, and structures reinforced. The mission was meant to be self-sufficient, an isolated world operating far from the centers of power that had ordered its creation. For the Spanish missionaries and soldiers, life was austere but purposeful. Many believed they were building something permanent, a civilizing force at the edge of empire. Others simply endured the isolation, aware that California was far from everything they knew. For the indigenous populations drawn into the mission system, life changed in ways that were immediate and irreversible. Indigenous communities had lived across California for thousands of years, adapting to the land through seasonal movement, local knowledge, and social networks built over generations. Their lives were not organized around fixed settlements or rigid schedules. The mission system disrupted this entirely. Conversion to Christianity was presented as a spiritual invitation, but in practice it often became an obligation. Once inside the mission, indigenous people were expected to abandon traditional beliefs, languages, and customs. Daily life was reorganized around Spanish norms, enforced by authority and reinforced by punishment. Movement became restricted. Time became regulated. Work was assigned. Diseases brought by Europeans spread rapidly among populations with no prior exposure. Illness weakened communities already struggling to adapt to a new social order. Mortality rates were high, especially among children. Yet even within this system, daily life was complex. People resisted quietly, adapted selectively, and preserved fragments of their culture in ways that outsiders rarely noticed. The missions were not places of total control, but spaces of constant tension, negotiation, and survival. The Spanish presence in California expanded not through sudden conquest, but through this slow, grinding transformation of everyday life. Alongside the missions, small military outposts, known as presidios, were established to protect Spanish claims. These were modest fortifications, often little more than walls, barracks, and storage rooms, positioned near key locations along the coast. The soldiers stationed there lived difficult lives. Pay was low, supplies unreliable, and the sense of isolation profound. Desertion was common, discipline was harsh, yet their presence symbolized authority. Cannons guarded harbors that saw little traffic. Flags flew over settlements that remained fragile and small. Spain's control was visible but thin. Communication with Mexico City or Madrid could take months. Orders arrived late. Decisions were often made locally, based on necessity rather than instruction. California operated in a state of semi-autonomy, governed as much by circumstance as by policy. This distance shaped everything. Rules bent, traditions adapted, authority was negotiated daily. Despite Spanish efforts, California in the late 18th century remained largely indigenous land. Vast regions lay beyond the reach of missions and presidios. Mountains, deserts, and forests limited movement and discouraged expansion. Settlements were isolated from one another. Travel between missions could take days, sometimes weeks. Each outpost existed as its own fragile world, dependent on local conditions and relationships. Spain's vision of California as a firmly controlled province remained unrealized. What existed instead was a scattered network of enclaves, connected by intention more than by reality, and yet the presence was enough to change the course of history. Because once Spain arrived, it became impossible for California to return to invisibility. By the end of the 18th century, California had begun to change, but not in the ways Spain had expected. The land resisted easy control. The population remained small. The empire's grip was fragile. Soon, the flag above California would change, not through revolution or battle, but through decisions made far beyond its borders. In the next chapter, we follow California as it passes from Spanish rule into Mexican control, entering a new phase of uncertainty, where authority weakened even further, and the future became increasingly unstable. By the early 19th century, California had been part of the Spanish Empire for more than 50 years. Yet despite decades of missions, presidios, and official claims, Spain's control remained fragile. The population was small, settlements were isolated, and the distance from imperial centers continued to shape daily life. California existed on the margins, governed as much by necessity as by law. Then, in 1821, everything changed. Spain lost control of its vast American territories after years of conflict and instability. Mexico emerged as an independent nation, inheriting lands that stretched far beyond its ability to effectively govern them. California, distant and sparsely populated, became part of this new republic almost by default. The transition from Spanish to Mexican rule did not arrive with dramatic announcements or visible upheaval. For most people living in California, daily life continued much as before. Missions still operated, fields were still worked, bells still marked the hours. The flag may have changed, but the rhythms of survival did not. Yet beneath the surface, authority had weakened. Mexico's new government was young, unstable, and focused on its own internal struggles. California, far from the capital, received little attention. Orders arrived late or not at all. Officials were replaced frequently. Loyalty became uncertain. This distance created opportunity. As Mexico sought to redefine its control over California, it began to dismantle the mission system that Spain had built. Large tracts of land were secularized and distributed as private grants, giving rise to vast ranchos that reshaped the landscape. These ranchos were enormous, stretching across valleys and hills, worked primarily through cattle ranching. Leather and tallow became the region's main exports, traded with foreign ships that began appearing more frequently along the coast. A new class of landowners emerged, often descendants of Spanish settlers or soldiers, now identifying themselves as Californios. Life on the ranchos followed a slower, seasonal rhythm. Days revolved around livestock, land management and trade, rather than bells and prayer schedules. Social life expanded. Families gathered for celebrations, rodeos, and communal events. California began to develop a distinct regional identity, neither fully Spanish nor fully Mexican, shaped by isolation and adaptation. But this way of life rested on unstable foundations. Mexico lacked the resources to defend California effectively. Military presence was limited. Settlements remained scattered. Foreign ships, British, American, Russian, visited ports with increasing regularity. Trade brought goods, information, and people from outside. Along with them came influence. American settlers began arriving overland, drawn by fertile land and opportunity. They settled quietly at first, integrating into local communities, marrying into Californio families, and establishing farms and businesses. Mexico's laws technically restricted foreign settlement, but enforcement was weak. California's authorities often welcomed newcomers, seeing them as a source of labor, trade, and protection. Slowly, the balance began to shift. California was no longer just a distant frontier. It was becoming a contested space. By the 1830s and 1840s, Mexican control over California had grown increasingly symbolic. Governors came and went. Local leaders exercised power independently. Loyalty to the central government weakened. Communication delays meant that decisions were often made without approval. Conflicts were resolved locally. Rules were bent or ignored. California functioned in a state of quiet autonomy, governed by custom rather than enforcement. At the same time, tensions grew between California landowners, indigenous communities, and newly arrived settlers. Land disputes increased. Cultural misunderstandings deepened. The fragile equilibrium that had held for decades began to crack. California stood between worlds. It was no longer Spanish, not fully Mexican, and not yet American. But change was approaching. By the mid-1840s, the future of California was no longer uncertain to outside observers. The United States, expanding rapidly westward, viewed California as both strategic and inevitable. Its ports offered access to the Pacific. Its land promised agricultural wealth. Its weak governance made it vulnerable. When war broke out between Mexico and the United States in 1846, California was unprepared. There were no major battles, no unified defense. Control shifted through small engagements, declarations, and negotiated surrenders. Once again, California changed hands without fully understanding what that change would mean. The transfer of power did not immediately transform California's daily life. For many, routines continued. Ranches still operated. Towns still functioned. But beneath that surface calm, forces were gathering. Within 2 years, a discovery would shatter every existing structure. Population, economy, and identity would be transformed at a speed California had never experienced. In the next chapter, we will witness the moment when California stopped being a quiet frontier and became a global obsession. When California passed into American control in the late 1840s, the change initially felt distant and abstract. Flags were raised, documents signed, and new authorities announced themselves. But daily life did not immediately collapse or transform. Ranches continued to operate. Towns functioned as they had before. The land looked the same. The rhythm of seasons remained unchanged. Yet beneath this surface continuity, the foundations of California were already shifting. The United States approached California differently from the empires that came before it. Where Spain and Mexico had ruled cautiously, constrained by distance and limited resources, the American system moved quickly, driven by expansion, private initiative, and population pressure. California was no longer a distant frontier to be protected. It was a destination to be absorbed. Then, in 1848, a single discovery altered everything. Gold was found in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. At first, the news spread slowly, carried by rumor and small reports. But once confirmed, it ignited a movement unlike anything California had experienced. Within months, people began arriving from every direction. By sea, Ships crowded the harbors. By land, trails filled with wagons and desperate travelers. California became the focus of global attention almost overnight. The quiet frontier disappeared. The population of California exploded at a pace that overwhelmed every existing structure. Settlements that had taken decades to form were suddenly surrounded by thousands of newcomers. Law, order, and governance struggled to keep up. Entire towns appeared in weeks, then vanished just as quickly. The California ranching economy collapsed under pressure. Land ownership became contested. Legal systems unfamiliar to longtime residents replaced older customs. Indigenous communities, already weakened by decades of disease and displacement, faced unprecedented violence and loss. California no longer moved slowly. It moved violently fast. Where missions and ranchos had once defined daily life, mining camps and port cities took their place. The landscape itself was altered, rivers redirected, hills stripped bare, forests cut down in the pursuit of wealth. What had once been a land shaped gently over generations was transformed in a matter of years. The California of 1769 was gone. By the early 1850s, California bore little resemblance to the territory Spain had cautiously entered less than a century earlier. It was no longer an overlooked edge of empire. It was a center of movement, ambition, and conflict. The United States formally admitted California as a state in 1850, solidifying its place within a new national framework. Cities expanded rapidly. Infrastructure followed. Laws were codified. Borders hardened. Yet beneath modern California, traces of its earlier lives remained. The mission still stood, weathered but present. Old trails became roads. Former rancho lands shaped modern property lines. Indigenous place names survived in altered forms. California's past did not disappear. It was buried beneath layers of transformation. To understand California as it exists today, it is necessary to return to 1769, to a moment before acceleration, before mass migration, before extraction reshaped the land. In that year, California was quiet, distant, and fragile. It was a place defined by balance rather than speed, by adaptation rather than conquest. Spain arrived not with certainty, but with hesitation. Mexico inherited not control, but responsibility it could not sustain. The United States absorbed California with overwhelming momentum. Each phase left its mark. The California we recognize today was not inevitable. It was the result of layered decisions, made far away, unfolding slowly at first, then all at once. California did not begin as a promise. It began as a question, a land observed from a distance, claimed before it was known, transformed before it was understood. In 1769, California stood at the threshold of change, still rooted in ancient rhythms, still shaped by the people who had lived there for thousands of years. Everything that followed grew from that moment of arrival, when invisibility ended and history accelerated. Beneath the highways, cities, and coastlines of modern California, that earlier land remains. Its traces endure in the landscape, in the names, and in the stories waiting to be remembered. If you'd like to see another place or moment in history reconstructed like this, leave a comment and tell us where, and when, you'd like to go next. Before we close this journey through the past, let us ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you hearing this story from a city shaped by history, a quiet town, or a place far from California? Leave your location in the comments and tell us where in the world you're listening from. History connects places and people across time, and your voice is now part of this story. This video is a historical reconstruction based on documented events and academic research. Some descriptions are interpretative, intended to help viewers visualize daily life in the past. See you in the next story.